The panel cracked on impact. That was the first thing Marcus Vane noticed, not the shriek of tearing hull plating, not the emergency beacon looping its useless cry into empty space, but the small hairline fracture running diagonally across the secondary navigation display, splitting the readout neatly in two. He stared at it for a full 3 seconds before his brain caught up with his body and reminded him that he was moving very fast in the wrong direction. "Override," he said to nobody. The ship's AI had gone offline 30 seconds into the descent. He'd been talking to himself since then, which his supervisor back at the 14th Survey Division would have called a bad sign. Marcus called it company. He pulled the manual yoke hard to port. The Linden, a mid-range survey scout, the kind of ship that nobody loved but everybody needed, groaned like a tired old dog asked to run, and then kept going straight down. Down being a relative term since he was in orbit, or had been. The object he'd struck, the thing the passive sensors had logged as debris, as dead metal, as nothing worth stopping for, was not debris. He understood that now. He understood it the way you understand something after you've already done the irreversible thing, with a particular cold clarity that doesn't help at all. The object was a ring structure, roughly 4 kilometers in diameter, hanging in perfect stationary orbit around the gas giant the survey charts called Mara 7, and which apparently someone else had already named something else entirely. The ring was made of dark material that barely showed on standard scan. It had been waiting there for, he guessed later, a very long time. He hit it at 11 kilometers per second. He survived because the impact wasn't full-on, a glancing blow, the port engine pod shearing against the ring's inner edge, and because the Linden, despite being nobody's favorite ship, had been built by people who understood that survey pilots in the outer territories died alone if they died at all, and so the survival cell around the cockpit was rated to impacts that would have turned any other section of the hull to vapor. He also survived because whatever the ring structure was, it caught him. He realized this approximately 4 seconds after the emergency thrusters fired and approximately 2 seconds after he stopped screaming. The ship was no longer spinning. It was being held, very gently, in a field of something that he had no instrument to measure because all his instruments were either cracked or dark. He was suspended, cradled almost. That was when the hull went translucent. Not transparent, translucent. A subtle shift in the material of the cockpit walls that made them glow faintly amber, and through that amber glow Marcus Vane saw the inside of the ring structure for the first time. It was not empty. It was a station. It had corridors and chambers and things moving in those corridors and chambers, and the things were not human. He sat very still. A habit he'd picked up in the outer territories, where the rule of thumb was, if you're not sure what's watching you, don't give it anything interesting to watch. One of the things stopped moving in the corridor nearest his cockpit. It turned. It had a head, 2 eyes or structures that functioned like eyes, large, deeply set, the color of polished tourmaline in the amber light. A body that stood upright, tall and narrow-shouldered, draped in something that moved like fabric but behaved more like armor, the way it shifted and settled. 4-fingered hands, he noted, because that was the kind of thing the survey division wanted to know, and old habits were the only habits he had left. 4 fingers. Long. The creature was looking at him with an expression he couldn't read, which was either because it had no expression or because he'd never learned to read one. He raised his hand. Not a salute, not a wave. Just palm forward, fingers spread, the way you'd show something that you were unarmed. An old human reflex so deep it predated language. The creature stared at him for another moment. Then it did something he didn't expect. It pressed 4 fingers to the transparent section of wall, briefly, and walked away. Then they boarded him. They came in through a section of hull that simply opened, which told him their technology was considerably more advanced than his own in at least one specific area. They filled his cockpit, 4 of them, tall and silent, the same narrow-shouldered build as the one in the corridor, their clothing shifting slowly as if breathing. And they looked at him with those tourmaline eyes, and he sat with his hands visible and breathed carefully and said, in Gal Standard, and then in the 3 other trade languages he spoke. My name is Marcus Vane. I'm a survey officer with the Terran 14th Survey Division. I entered your structure by accident. I'm sorry. They didn't speak. They had a way of communicating that he only understood later, a low-frequency resonance that moved through the skin before it reached the ears, subvocal, almost subsensory. He felt the edges of it, the way you feel a sound you can't quite hear, a pressure in the chest that carried meaning the way music carries meaning, not in words but in something underneath words. What it carried roughly was, he would come with them. He came with them. The station was larger on the inside than it had appeared from the outside, which was either a trick of perspective or something more deliberate. The corridors were high and curved, the material of the walls a dark composite that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, so that the ambient illumination came from somewhere he couldn't identify, a sourceless glow, blue-white, like early morning through heavy cloud. It was cold. Not bitterly so, but the kind of cold that settled into the joints over time. Marcus walked in the middle of his 4 escorts and counted things. Junctions, chambers, the number of other beings he saw and what they were doing. 37 individuals in the sections he passed through, give or take. Some stopped to watch him go by. Most didn't. Whatever he was to them, a curiosity, an intrusion, a problem, he wasn't important enough to stare at. That, in his experience, was actually a good sign. They brought him to a large chamber. He didn't understand it was a throne room until he'd been standing in it for several seconds, because it looked nothing like a throne room. No raised platform, no obvious seat of power, no symbolism he could parse. Just a wide circular space, the floor a dark mineral that rang faintly underfoot, and at the far end a cluster of beings arranged in a rough crescent, watching him. In the center of the crescent, slightly forward of the others, stood the tallest of them. He was clearly significant, the quality of his clothing, the way the others oriented toward him without looking at him, the particular stillness he held. Old. Not human old, not age the way humans wore it, but something in the eyes that made Marcus think of deep water. Unfathomable, slow, patient with a patience that had run out of hurry a very long time ago. Flanking him, 2 beings in ceremonial garments, the cut more elaborate, the material more alive-looking in its slow movement. And beside the one on the left, set slightly apart from the cluster, a figure in a chair. Not exactly a chair, a structure that seemed to grow from the floor and curve around its occupant like a hand cupping something valuable. In the chair sat a female, he decided female on instinct, the proportions different from the others in ways he couldn't have named precisely, the bearing something like resting rather than standing at attention. She was younger than the tall one, considerably, and in her arms she held a small bundle. He almost didn't notice the bundle at first. He was looking at the tall one, reading posture, trying to find the shape of what was coming. It was only when one of his escorts touched his arm lightly, redirecting, that he looked at the figure in the chair. She was holding an infant. The infant was looking at him. Not at the room, not at the ceiling, not with the vague, unfocused gaze of something newly in the world. The infant was looking at him, specifically in the way that things look at other things when they have decided those other things are worth the effort of looking. Then it reached for him. Such a small gesture. Both tiny hands extending, fingers splayed, the body leaning forward slightly from the cradle of its mother's arms, reaching toward him, toward Marcus Vane, survey officer, accidental intruder, man who had crashed his ship into a space station and was currently standing in a throne room trying very hard to remain calm. The entire royal court froze. He felt it before he saw it, that subvocal resonance that moved through the skin went suddenly, completely still. The pressure in his chest that had been a constant low hum since he entered the station dropped to nothing, like the silence after a bell stops. Every being in the room stopped moving. And in that frozen moment, the only thing that moved was those two tiny hands reaching. Marcus looked at the infant. He looked at its mother. He looked at the tall one who was staring at those reaching hands with an expression that he could read, finally, because it was the same expression a human face made when confronted with the impossible, when the mind hit a fact it couldn't process and simply stopped. A stillness so complete it looked like fear. He didn't know what to do. So he did what seemed right. He took a small step forward. Not threatening, slow, deliberate, one foot and then the other, hands still visible, posture open. He crossed the floor of the throne room while every living being in it watched him in that absolute silence. He stopped when he was 2 arms lengths from the mother's chair, and he looked at the infant and the infant looked at him, and its hands were still reaching. He raised one hand and very gently, very carefully, extended 2 fingers toward those reaching hands. The infant grabbed them. 4 small fingers, 2 of his, a grip that was surprisingly strong for something so new to the world. It held on. And Marcus Vane, who was 34 years old and had spent 11 years in the outer territories, and who had been in more bad situations than he cared to count, felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't known was tight. The room stayed silent for another long moment. Then the tall one made a sound that was nothing like a word, or was entirely a word in a language of pure resonance, and it went through Marcus's skin and landed somewhere under his ribs, and what it carried was not threat, not welcome either, not yet. Something between the two, something that sounded, underneath the alien frequency of it, like, this was not expected. They put him in comfortable rooms. That was the first sign. Not a cell. He checked the door and it opened at a touch, which meant either they were very confident he couldn't go anywhere or he wasn't a prisoner. And since he was on a space station in the outer territories with no functional ship and no idea where in the system he was, both were equally true. The rooms were large and sparse and cold in the way the whole station was cold, but there was a sleeping surface that was not uncomfortable, and what appeared to be water in a sealed container and something that looked like food and probably was. He ate it carefully. It tasted of nothing in particular, which was better than he'd feared. He sat on the sleeping surface and thought about what had happened. The infant reaching for him, the court freezing, the tall one's expression. He'd been a survey officer long enough to know that first contact protocols were written by people who'd never actually had first contact, and that they were accordingly useless. He'd also been out here long enough to understand that the one thing that got humans killed in encounters with non-human intelligences wasn't aggression. It wasn't misunderstanding. It was a particular kind of human instinct, the need to fill silence, to explain, to cover discomfort with noise. The instinct to talk when listening was what was needed. He decided to wait and see what they did. What they did was send her. The mother came to his room 8 hours after they'd put him there. She came alone, which surprised him. She was taller standing than he'd expected, and without the infant she moved differently, less careful, more direct, the way people moved when they weren't watching what they were holding. She sat across from him on a structure that appeared from the floor when she needed it, and she looked at him for a long time. He looked back. The resonance communication, when she used it, was different from the others, warmer, somehow, or more present, as if the others had broadcast and she was speaking directly to him. He caught more of it than he'd caught before. He felt the shapes of what she was trying to convey rather than just the bare emotional weight. She was asking about him, not interrogating, asking, the way you asked about someone you were trying to understand. He spoke aloud in Gal Standard slowly. I don't know if you can understand me. I'm guessing no, based on how the others responded. A pause. My name is Marcus. I'm human. I come from a planet called Earth, third from a sun in the Orion Arm. We've been in space for about 200 years. He stopped. How did you explain a species to another species in a single sentence? We're curious. That's mostly what we are. It gets us into trouble. She watched him speak. When he stopped, she made a sound, not the subvocal resonance, an actual vocalization, light and precise, a series of tones that clearly meant something and that he couldn't parse at all. But she was watching his face while she did it. Reading him, he realized. The same way he was reading her. He tapped his own chest. "Marcus." She tapped hers. A sound like Velsira, 2 tones, the second rising. "Velsira," he tried. She made a different sound, shorter, which he was fairly sure was amusement. They did this for 2 hours. It was the slowest conversation he'd ever had and one of the most careful, and at the end of it he knew her name approximately and she knew his, and they'd established 4 other concepts between them through gesture and repetition and the kind of patient creative miming that he'd have found embarrassing anywhere else. Numbers, pointing, the general concept of a question and the general concept of an answer, tiny things. But they were the same tiny things that his distant ancestors had figured out with every stranger they'd ever met, and they added up to something. At the door, leaving, she paused and looked back at him. She made the rising 2-tone sound again, her name, and then she made another sound, a 3rd tone below the 2, and touched her own chest and then extended her hand toward where he sat. He thought about it for a moment. "I'm not sure what that means," he said, "but I think," he touched his own chest, the same gesture she'd used. "I think maybe you're saying something like, 'I see you.'" She held his gaze for another moment, then she left. He sat with that for a while. On the 3rd day, the tall one came. He came with 6 others arranged in a formal pattern around him, which told Marcus this was official and deliberate, and not a casual visit. He stood in the center of Marcus's room and looked at him with those deep-water eyes, and the resonance he projected was dense with layered meaning, complex in the way the older being's resonance always was, as if they'd had more time to develop the language of it, more depth to draw from. Marcus stood to meet him, not because he had to, because it seemed right. The tall one made a formal gesture, both hands together, a precise movement, and waited. Marcus thought about the ways humans greeted each other. The nod, the bow, the handshake. He chose the one that seemed most honest. He brought his right hand to his own chest, palm flat, briefly. A gesture that in some old human cultures meant nothing more than, "My heart is here. I am sincere." The tall one watched this. And then he did something unexpected. He mirrored it, right hand to his own chest, exactly as Marcus had done. Marcus had been in enough strange rooms over enough years to know that was significant. The resonance that followed was long and structured, and he caught about a quarter of it, which was more than he'd expected. What he caught was a question about the infant, about what had happened when the infant reached for him, about whether he had done something to make it happen. He shook his head slowly. "No, I didn't do anything, I just stood there." The tall one seemed to consider this. The resonance he projected in response was complex, layered in ways Marcus couldn't fully decode, but at the center of it was something like, "That is exactly the problem." Velsira explained it to him over the following days, in the slow, patient way they'd developed, a combination of her resonance, which he was getting better at catching, and his spoken language, which she was beginning to follow in rough outline. She explained it in pieces, the way you explained something that required translation at every step. Her people were called the Velkari. They had been a spacefaring civilization for 6,000 years, which was long enough to have certain convictions about how the universe worked, including this one, that the capacity for psychic resonance, the communication through subvocal frequency, through skin and bone and the body's own electrical field, was the measure of a mind's development. Primitive minds did not resonate. Developed minds did. Advanced minds resonated with precision and depth, could send and receive complex meaning, could form consensus through resonance alone. The Velkari were very advanced. Humans, by all evidence, did not resonate at all. Marcus thought about this. "We talk," he said. with our mouths through the air. She had the facial equivalent of a small smile now, something she'd developed over their sessions. We know, we observed your species, for some time. Without making contact. We did not believe contact was worthwhile, she paused. You do not resonate, you cannot reach the mind directly. You require physical media, air, pressure, vibration. To us this seems she searched. A very primitive arrangement. You thought we were animals. We thought you were not ready. Another pause. It is different. He let that sit. What changed? She was quiet for a moment. Then, my daughter. The infant's name was Velani, and she was 3 months old by Velkari reckoning, which was close to 8 months by human reckoning, and she was the first child born to the royal line in 40 years. The Velkari did not reproduce quickly. This had something to do with their biology and something to do with the nature of their resonance. A new mind, when it arrived, could not yet control its resonance, could not modulate or direct it. It broadcast freely, unfiltered, picking up on things the trained adult mind had learned to ignore. An infant was, in Velkari terms, the most sensitive instrument in any room. In the first months of life, a Velkari infant reached toward what it felt resonating most strongly around it. Not what it saw, not what made noise, what resonated. Velani had never, in 3 months, reached toward anyone outside the immediate family. She had reached toward Marcus. You don't resonate, Velsira said, and there was something in her voice that he'd come to recognize as careful thinking. And yet she reached for you, which means. Something reached her, Marcus said slowly. That isn't your kind of resonance. Yes. He thought about that for a long time. How did your court take it? She looked at him with those tourmaline eyes. My father, the one you met, he is first voice of the Velkari. What he believes, the court believes. What the court believes shapes policy. A pause. For 6,000 years, first voice has held that resonance is the measure of mind, that those who do not resonate do not fully think, do not reach the same quality of inner life. She paused again. The infant has disputed this position. Marcus almost laughed. He caught it in time. What does your father believe now? He does not yet know what to believe. This is, she chose a word carefully, uncomfortable for a first voice. I imagine it is. He will want to speak with you. I know. I'm ready. She looked at him with something he'd been seeing more of lately, something that had started very small and grown over the hours of their conversations, a quality of attention that wasn't simply study. How? She asked. How are you ready? You are one person on a broken ship in an unknown station with no means of communication or return. How are you? She made a gesture he'd come to understand meant something like, unbothered, calm. He thought about it honestly. I've been in bad situations before. The ones that kill you, you can't do anything about. The ones you survive by staying clear-headed. He looked at his hands. And I keep thinking about your daughter, about her reaching out like that. Toward a stranger who didn't look like anyone she'd ever seen. He paused. Doesn't that tell you something about what she is? About what your people are underneath all the evolved sophistication? Velsira was quiet for a long time. Perhaps, she said finally, it tells us something about what you are. The formal audience with the first voice happened on the 7th day. The throne room looked different this time, not in its physical arrangement, which was unchanged, but in its feeling. He'd spent a week in this station. He knew the cold of its corridors by now, the sourceless blue-white light, the way the floor rang faintly underfoot. He'd walked its sections with Velsira as escort, been observed and then, gradually, ignored, the way you were ignored once you stopped being a curiosity and became simply part of the environment. He'd watched the Velkari work and rest and communicate in their resonant silence, and what he'd noticed was, they were very good at many things, and there was at least one thing they had stopped being good at, which was being surprised. He walked into the throne room and the first voice was already there, and between them, held by Velsira, was Velani. The infant looked at him immediately. She was awake and alert, and she made a sound, not Velkari resonance, not the subvocal frequency, just a pure, clear vocalization, the kind of sound something made when it saw something it recognized. The court didn't freeze this time. They'd had 7 days to prepare for what the infant did. But he watched them try to maintain composure and understood that the preparation hadn't helped much. The first voice spoke for a long time in full resonance, which Marcus caught in fragments and shards. Velsira translated in low murmurs at his shoulder, the formal register, slower and more precise than their private conversations. What the first voice said, roughly, was this. The Velkari had been watching humanity for 60 years, long enough to catalog their technology, their politics, their history, their biology. They had not made contact because the evidence did not support it. Humans did not resonate. Humans were loud, physical, expansive. They communicated through the crude medium of air vibration and relied on technology as a substitute for the inherent capacities a truly evolved mind should possess. They had been to space for only 200 years. They were, in Velkari terms, new. And now this. An infant of the royal line, the most sensitive resonance detector in the Velkari civilization, had reached toward a human. The first voice paused. The court waited. Marcus waited. What the first voice said next, Velsira translated very carefully. This presents a problem not of protocol but of understanding. We do not know what the child felt. We do not know what you carry that she could feel it. You do not resonate. And yet, he looked at Marcus directly for the first time, not past him, not at the wall behind him, but at him. And yet she reached. Marcus had been thinking about what to say for 7 days. He'd written it in his head 100 times in various registers, formal, deferential, strategic. He'd rehearsed arguments about human cognition, about the nature of communication, about the possibility that resonance wasn't the only valid frequency on which a mind could operate. He said none of them. He said, I don't know what she felt either. I'm not being evasive, I genuinely don't know. We don't have your kind of resonance. We never developed it. We developed other things instead. He paused. We make things. We build things and wreck them and build them again differently. We cross distances we have no business crossing and crash into structures we had no idea were there, and we sit in the wreckage and figure out what to do next. He stopped, started again. We're very bad at giving up. I think that's what it is at the bottom of everything. When we don't have the capacity to do something the elegant way, we find another way, and we keep finding other ways until we find one that works. And I think he looked at the infant in Velsira's arms, those eyes that hadn't left him since he walked in. I think maybe that's what she felt. Not resonance. Something else. Something underneath resonance. Something old enough that your species and mine both have it, even if we carry it differently. The room was very quiet. The first voice looked at him for a long time. His expression did something Marcus hadn't seen it do before. Not the blank processing stillness, not the impossible fact freeze, something more human in the paradoxical sense, a deepening. The face of someone encountering a thought they hadn't had yet and finding it difficult and worthwhile at the same time. He made a resonance gesture to the court, both hands forward briefly, which Velsira had told him meant something like, consider this, remember this, it has weight. Then he spoke and Velsira translated quietly, you will remain here, not as a prisoner, as a pause while she found the word, as a question we have not yet answered. We do not make contact with species we have not yet understood. We have not yet understood you. We find we wish to. Marcus nodded. That's the most any two people can ask of each other. The first voice looked at him. And then it was a small thing, but Marcus had been reading alien faces for a week. Something shifted. A minute relaxation in the set of the eyes. Not a smile. Something more fundamental than a smile. He brought his right hand to his own chest, palm flat, briefly. My heart is here, I am sincere. He spent 2 months on the Velkari station. He wasn't idle. The 14th Survey Division had a saying, wherever you end up, you're still doing the job. He documented everything he could, the station's layout, the Velkari daily patterns, their technology's observable properties, their social hierarchy, their resonance communication system. He did this carefully, systematically, in the small notebook he kept in his flight jacket's inner pocket, and he made clear to Velsira that he was doing it and what he was writing. She read some of it. She corrected some of it. This became, gradually, a collaborative project. He learned their language in pieces, not the full resonance that would take years and required biological equipment he didn't have, but the vocal tones, the formalized register they used for cross-frequency communication, the kind of language you developed when you needed to talk to someone you couldn't quite reach. Velsira learned his. They met in the middle, in a vocabulary that belonged to neither of them, which was how all real communication worked. He held Velani twice. The first time was an accident. Velsira was handling a resonance document, and her hands were occupied, and the infant was fussing, and without thinking Marcus took her, settled her against his chest the way he'd watched Velsira do it, and she immediately stopped fussing and looked up at him with those tourmaline eyes. He stood very still, not wanting to break whatever this was, and after a moment he heard himself humming. Something his mother had hummed when he was small, a tune he didn't know the name of that he'd forgotten he remembered. The infant listened to this. Her eyes stayed on his face. He didn't know how long he stood like that. Long enough for Velsira to finish her work and look up and go very still herself, watching. Long enough for one of the court attendants passing in the corridor to stop in the doorway and observe. News traveled fast in a resonance-based society. The second time he held Velani was deliberate. Velsira brought her to his room the morning before his ship was scheduled to be repaired and returned to him, sat across from him, and held the infant out. He took her. He sat with her in the sourceless blue-white light of an alien space station, an infant who was technically royalty looking up at him with complete uncomplicated attention, and he thought, this is the thing that gets written in history books eventually. Not the crash, not the formal audiences, not the language building and the document treating and the careful navigation of a court that didn't know what to make of him. This moment, a person and a child in a quiet room, both of them just present. She grabbed his finger again, the same grip as the first time, surprisingly strong. He looked at Velsira. She's going to be a handful when she's older. Velsira had learned enough of his language to understand this, and she made the sound he'd come to understand was the closest her people had to a laugh. Yes, she said. She takes after her mother. The first voice came to see him off personally. That was unexpected. Velsira had warned him that the first voice rarely visited the docking section, that it was a significant departure from protocol. He arrived with 6 attendants in formal arrangement and stood before Marcus's repaired ship, or mostly repaired, patched in 3 places with Velkari composite material that was considerably better than the original, because of course it was, and regarded him with those deep-water eyes. He made the resonance gesture that meant, attend carefully, this is important. Velsira at Marcus's shoulder translated. He says, we have discussed what you are, we have not concluded, he says. In 6,000 years we have never sent contact to a species before we understood them. He says, we do not understand you, he says, we are going to contact you anyway. Marcus looked at the first voice. I appreciate that. The translation went back. The first voice made another resonance gesture, and this one Velsira was quiet about for a moment before she translated it. He says, you crashed into us, uninvited. You showed no aggression and offered no submission. You extended 2 fingers toward a royal infant and did not know what you were doing. A pause. He says, in 6,000 years nothing has surprised us. You surprised us. This is, she paused again very carefully. He says the word we use for something that is simultaneously a disruption and a gift. There is no direct translation. Marcus thought about it. We'd probably just call it a mess, he said. A beautiful mess. Velsira translated this. The first voice was quiet for a moment. Then he brought his right hand to his own chest, palm flat, briefly. And the 6 attendants, watching him, all did the same. Marcus brought his hand to his chest in return. He looked at the first voice, who had spent 6,000 years knowing what he knew, and then 1 week not knowing, and had decided to find it worthwhile. He looked at Velsira, who had come to a stranger's room and spent hours building a vocabulary neither of them had owned before. He thought about Velana's grip on his fingers, the particular surety of it. He said, "Tell him we crash into a lot of things. We're sorry in advance." The translation went back. The first voice looked at him for one more long moment. And then he did something Marcus had not seen any Velkari do. Something that crossed no cultural line Marcus could name, didn't require translation, wasn't learned from watching humans or built from any borrowed vocabulary. He smiled. Marcus Vane filed his survey report 6 weeks after returning to the division. It ran to 47 pages, which was 35 more than standard. His supervisor read it 3 times and then called him in and stared at him across a desk for approximately the amount of time it takes a human brain to process something it isn't fully equipped to process. "You crashed into a 6,000-year-old alien civilization," she said. "Into their outer ring structure, yes, technically. And their royal infant. Reach for me, yes. And now they want to make contact. Formal contact. They're already drafting the framework." He paused. "They're very thorough, it might take a while." She stared at him. "How are you so calm about this?" He thought about the cold corridors and the sourceless light. A vocabulary built from nothing. An infant with a surprisingly strong grip. A first voice who had spent 6,000 years being certain, and had found, in the space of one unplanned collision, something more interesting than certainty. "I've had a lot of time to think about it," he said, "and I think," he leaned back, "I think the universe is considerably more willing to talk to us than we expected. We just kept waiting for an invitation." He picked up his notebook, the worn one from the inner pocket of his flight jacket, 47 pages of impossible careful notes in margins and between lines. "Turns out we were already invited. We just had to crash through the door." His supervisor looked at him for another moment. Then she laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, the kind that wasn't planned. "Get out of my office," she said, "and get some sleep." He got up to go. At the door he paused. He brought his right hand to his own chest, palm flat, briefly. She looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means my heart is here, I'm sincere." He put his hand down. "A friend taught me." He walked out into the corridor, and the light was nothing like the sourceless blue-white of an alien station, and the air had the particular flat recycled quality of division air, and everything was loud with human noise, voices and footsteps and the distant clatter of a survey division in full operational swing. And he stood in the middle of all of it and felt, very specifically, glad to be exactly what he was. A person who crashed into things, who sat in the wreckage, who figured out what to do next, who reached back. The repair work took 11 days. He spent those 11 days in a kind of suspended state he'd never quite experienced before, not captivity, not freedom, not quite either. A liminal space, which was, he supposed, appropriate for a person floating between 2 civilizations that hadn't yet figured out what to make of each other. He requested to watch the repair work on the 2nd day, and they allowed it. 3 Velkari engineers, younger than the ones he'd seen in administrative roles, with a particular quality of focused intensity that he recognized because it was universal. People who cared deeply about the thing they were doing, worked on the Linden's hull with instruments he couldn't identify doing things he could only partially observe. The composite patch material they used was extraordinary. He watched them apply it and tried to understand the process and couldn't, and wrote down everything he observed anyway, because that was the job. One of the engineers caught him watching and taking notes. The engineer came over and looked at his notebook, the handwriting, the diagrams, and then looked at him with an expression that Marcus had been learning to read as the Valkyrie version of professional interest. He showed the engineer the diagrams he'd made, pointing from the diagrams to the actual repair work, making clear what he understood and what he didn't. The engineer studied his notebook for a moment, and then made a resonance gesture Marcus hadn't encountered before. That evening he described the gesture to Velsira. She was quiet for a moment. "It means roughly, you are," she paused. "We have a word for an apprentice, someone in the early stage of learning a craft. Someone who does not yet know how to do the thing but who understands how to want to learn the thing." The gesture acknowledges that quality. It is not condescending. It is respectful, actually. You recognize what you don't know. This is considered a skill. Marcus thought about that. In my experience, most people consider not knowing an obstacle, something to hide. For us also, many do. The ones who are very good at their craft, usually not. He wrote that down too. The engineer came back the next morning. He had a flat surface device with him, a Valkyrie interface, smooth and dark, glowing faintly at the edges, and he showed Marcus, in patient gestures, diagrams of the composite material and how it bonded with the Linden's hull material. Not why it worked, the how. The engineer was watching his face while explaining, adjusting the pace and the complexity based on what Marcus's expression told him. In the way a good teacher adjusted to a student, the fundamental communication of "I see that you see" being the entire pedagogical engine. Marcus asked questions, not with words mostly, with gestures pointing, indicating uncertainty through the universal body language of confusion. The engineer answered, not with words either mostly. They built a vocabulary of their own, simpler than the one Marcus was building with Velsira, technical rather than conceptual but real. On the fourth day, the engineer let Marcus assist with a section of the repair work, a minor section. He made one mistake and the engineer corrected it without judgment, just the clear indication of what the right movement was, done again, until Marcus understood. He thought about this later in his room, about how the Valkyrie court's paralysis, that frozen moment when the infant reached for him, had been about meaning, about what the gesture signified in the framework of everything they believed. But the engineer hadn't cared about frameworks. The engineer had a ship to fix and a person who wanted to understand, and those two things were more than enough to build from. Maybe that was what the infant had felt, not the philosophical content of being human, just that, someone who wanted to understand, a mind oriented toward the world with interest rather than threat. A quality so basic that an infant could feel it before she had words for anything, before she had the full adult capacity for resonance, in the raw, uncomplicated way that new beings felt the shapes of things before they learned their names. He wrote this in the notebook. He wrote it in plain language, not the careful survey-to-vision language, just his own words, because sometimes the plain version was the true version. On the sixth day, 3 members of the formal court came to observe him. Not the first voice, subordinates, he thought, based on the resonance Velsira had taught him to read in the quality of their clothing and the way they moved. They came without announcement and stood at the doorway of his room and watched him. He was working on his language notes, the slow, careful phonetic transcription he'd been building. He looked up when he heard the movement, registered who they were, and went back to his work. After a moment, one of them came inside. The others stayed at the door. The one who came inside moved around the perimeter of his room looking at things, his notebook, the small objects he'd arranged on the sleeping surface, a pen, the emergency multi-tool from his flight suit, a folded square of cloth. The food container from that morning empty. Marcus watched him from his peripheral vision and kept writing. The court observer stopped at the notebook. Marcus looked up fully. The observer was looking at the open page, a diagram he'd made of the station's junction structure, the best he could reconstruct from memory, with phonetic notations of Velkhari resonance words labeled at different sections. He offered the notebook. The observer looked at him, a long, still moment. He took the notebook. He examined the pages with an attention that Marcus recognized because he'd seen it in Velsira and in the engineer, the particular quality of engagement that meant someone was genuinely encountering something rather than performing interest. He turned pages, stopped at the language section, Marcus's phonetic transcription of the Velkhari formal vocal register, 43 entries so far, with notes on context and usage. The observer read this for a long time. He made a resonance gesture Marcus didn't know. He looked at Marcus and made it again. Marcus shook his head, indicating he didn't understand. The observer came to him, still holding the notebook, and sat across from him, and began, deliberately and carefully, to teach him what the gesture meant. It meant, "Who taught you this?" "Velsira," Marcus said, the rising two-tone version of the name. "She has been very patient." The observer looked at him for another moment. Then, slowly, he made a resonance gesture that Marcus had learned from Velsira in their second conversation. "I understand you." Marcus made it back, "I understand you." Something shifted in the observer's posture, not dramatically, just the small adjustment a person made when they stopped bracing for something. He left with the other two court members an hour later. He took the notebook briefly to copy something. Marcus led him without comment and returned it. 2 of the pages had small marks on them. Notes, he guessed. The observer's own record of what he'd observed. The next morning there were 4 more observers. In the afternoon, 2 of them came inside. By the 8th day, the court had effectively sent a rotating delegation to sit with him. Nobody called it that, but that was what it was. They watched him take notes and work on language and eat and think, and gradually, 1s and 2s of them began to engage, showing him things, pointing at items and providing the resonance stone for the concept, then correcting his attempts to replicate it. Building vocabulary deliberately, not just with Velsira now, but with however many of the Velkhari court found themselves curious enough to try. On the 9th day, one of them brought him food from their own supply rather than the neutral substance blocks he'd been given. It was different, more complex, layered flavors he couldn't identify, textures that surprised him. He ate it carefully and expressed something, through the modest vocabulary he had by then, that was in the vicinity of, "This is good. I thank you." The one who had brought it made a resonance that was clearly pleased, the Velkhari equivalent of satisfaction at a response received. He thought, somewhere in the 6,000-year history of this people, nobody had ever brought food to someone who couldn't resonate and been thanked in their own rough approximate language and felt pleased about it. This was new. New was uncomfortable, yes, but the uncomfortable things were also, often, the ones that mattered. Velsira told him about her daughter on the 10th day. They were in the corridor outside his room. She'd been walking with him, a daily habit they'd developed, 2 circuits of the accessible section of the station in the sourceless blue-white light. It was something Marcus had asked for early on, needing movement, and she'd accommodated it with the pragmatic flexibility that he'd come to see was particular to her. Other members of the court made accommodations formally, as concessions. She just did what seemed useful. She told him, Velani was unusual even among Velkhari infants. The early resonance sensitivity was not uncommon, but its strength in her daughter was. She'd reached before, briefly, toward Velsira's father, the first voice, which was expected, familial resonance being the most natural first contact. But before Marcus, she had never reached toward anyone outside the bloodline. Not even toward senior court members who had been around her since her birth, and who resonated with considerable sophistication. "Why me?" Marcus said. It wasn't quite a question. I have been thinking about this for 10 days. Velsira was quiet for a moment as they walked. I believe, and this is not established, this is my thinking. I believe she felt something that is not resonance but is related to it. The way that light and warmth are not the same thing but have a relationship. You think humans carry something analogous to resonance. I think you carry something that produces similar effects in a sensitive enough receiver. Something in the electromagnetic field of the body, perhaps. Something in the patterning of thought. I don't know. She paused. I know that when you are present in a particular way, when you are paying full attention to something, there is a quality to it that I notice, that I find difficult to describe in our formal register because our formal register was not built to describe it. It is, she stopped walking. You know the concept of a frequency that is below hearing, that you feel rather than hear. Infrasound. Yes, I think when you are fully present, attending to something without distraction, without agenda, without the kind of internal chatter I understand humans have, you produce something in that register, below the threshold of our resonance. But there, she looked at him. My daughter is below the threshold of control. She is pure reception. She felt it. Marcus stood in the sourceless blue-white light and thought about an infant reaching toward him, and the entire royal court freezing. All I was doing, he said slowly, was trying not to make things worse. Yes, and in doing only that you became something she had not felt before, a mind that was, Velsira searched. Quiet attending, without agenda, a pause. Most minds in a room like that are not quiet, even ours. We moderate our resonance, but we are always generating. She felt you not generating. She felt the absence of noise, and in that absence she felt what was underneath. He thought about the field notebook in his pocket, about sitting very still in the wreckage of the Linden in the first moments after impact, not making a sound, about the old territory rule. If you don't know what's watching you, don't give it anything interesting to watch. I've spent 11 years trying to make myself useful in spaces where I didn't belong, he said. I learned pretty early that the most useful thing you could do, most of the time, was shut up and pay attention. Velsira made the sound that was her laugh. 6,000 years of civilization, she said, and we may have waited too long to talk to you. On the last evening, the court gathered. Not in the throne room in a larger space, one he hadn't been to before that he suspected was used for significant occasions. It had the same dark mineral floor and the same sourceless light, but the ceiling was higher and the walls had something in them. A texture, faintly luminescent, that he hadn't seen anywhere else in the station. Symbols, he thought. History encoded in the material of the walls. There were 47 Velkari in the room, he counted. They arranged themselves in a wide circle with him in the approximate center, Velsira at his shoulder, Velani in her arms. The first voice stood directly across from him, the diameter of the circle between them. The first voice spoke for a long time in the full formal resonance. Marcus caught more than he expected, which was still less than a quarter, but it was enough to follow the shape of it. Velsira translated in a low murmur beside him, the words small and careful. The first voice spoke of their history, of 6,000 years of reaching outward and finding, again and again, the same result. Minds that resonated in ways that were recognizable, that could be met and measured and understood through the established framework. And then occasionally minds that did not resonate, and those minds in every previous instance had proven to be exactly what the framework predicted they would be. Limited, early, not yet ready for contact. The framework had been reliable. The framework had worked. He paused. The room held its collective still. He said, Velsira translating quietly, that frameworks were tools, and tools were only as good as the problems they were built for. That the usefulness of a tool was different from the truth of it. That this distinction was easy to forget over 6,000 years. He said that a child of 3 months, who did not yet have the capacity to lie or perform or construct, who received the world without the filter of interpretation, That child had reached toward a human. He said that the court would be wrong to dismiss this, and it would also be wrong to explain it away too quickly, to force it into the existing framework without asking whether the framework needed to change. He said, and this was where Velsira's translation slowed, became more careful, as if she was making sure she had it right. He said that in 6,000 years, the Velkhari had never been wrong about the fundamental nature of an unknown thing before they had finished understanding it. They had been thorough. They had been careful. They had been correct. And correctness over a long enough time became a kind of wall. The wall kept out error, but it also kept out information. And information, unlike certainty, was what you needed when you encountered something new. He said, "This human has been here for 11 days. In 11 days, he has learned portions of our language, documented this station with significant accuracy, repaired his ship alongside our engineers, and shared meals and language with members of this court who had never voluntarily approached an uncontacted species member before. He has done this without aggression, without submission, and without asking anything except to understand." He said, "I do not know what to make of this." He said, "I find at my age, after 6,000 years of my people's accumulated knowing, that I do not know what to make of this." He said, "I think that is worth something." The room was quiet for a long time. Then the first voice made the resonance gesture, both hands forward briefly. That meant, "Attend to this, it is wait." And then he added something that Velsira translated with a pause before she spoke it. He says, "We will send formal contact within the year." He says he would like you to be present for it. He says he is aware that is an unusual request for a species we have not yet made contact with. He says he is making it anyway. Marcus looked across the circle at the first voice. He thought of everything he'd written in 47 pages, of the engineer and the composite material and the vocabulary built from nothing, of Velsira's laugh and the subvocal resonance he felt in his chest before he heard it, of an infant who had no agenda and had reached for a stranger because the stranger was, underneath all the noise and all the not knowing, quiet. He brought his right hand to his chest, palm flat, briefly. The first voice mirrored it. And this time the court didn't freeze. They watched, all 47 of them, in that high-ceilinged room with its luminescent walls encoding 6,000 years of history, and they were still, but it was a different stillness. Not the stillness of something stopped, the stillness of something that had just heard a sound it recognized and hadn't yet found the word for. Velani made a sound from her mother's arms, a pure, clear vocalization that had no language in it yet, nothing but itself, and it filled the room with the simple fact of a new thing arriving in a space that had been the same for a very long time. He cleared atmosphere at 8:47 station time, the Velkhari's method of timekeeping which he'd spent 4 days learning to read. The station fell away behind him, the dark ring structure, barely visible in the scanner now, the ambient light of Mara 7 gas clouds making it a shadow against a deeper shadow. He held course for a moment, just a moment. Then he opened the comms, the fixed beam, the one that didn't depend on relay networks, the one with the shortest range and the most direct signal path, and sent a message back to the station. Not survey division encoding, not any formal protocol, just his voice. "Marcus Vane, 14th Survey signing off. It's been a privilege." He paused. "Tell her she can let go when she's ready. I'll be back." He didn't know if the signal would reach the right person. He didn't know if Velsira spoke enough of his language yet to understand all of it. He didn't know if Velani, 3 months old and already impossible, would remember any of this in the way that mattered. He knew that in the survey division's records, this encounter would be cataloged under first contact incidents, unplanned, with a note that the initiating officer had conducted himself in accordance with standing protocols for non-hostile encounter situations, which was both technically true and completely wrong about what had actually happened. What had actually happened was that he'd crashed into something, sat very still in the wreckage, and let the silence do the work that words couldn't. He'd reached out 2 fingers toward an infant who reached back. And everything in that small exchange had changed. He set his course for home, in the loud, alive, particular human noise of his own breathing and the Linden's engines, and outside the viewport Mara 7 turned slowly in its own indifferent light, enormous and incurious, and somewhere in the ring structure circling it, 47 members of a civilization 6,000 years old were sitting with something they didn't have a framework for yet. He hoped it kept bothering them for a while. The things that didn't fit the framework were always the most interesting. He flew home through the dark, humming a tune he didn't know the name of, that he'd forgotten he remembered, that his mother used to hum when he was small. He hummed it for a long time,